Hello everybody and thank you for tuning in. This is a very special video that I'm creating at home, but I wanted to take a second to finish talking about Max Weber and continue the conversation that we had today about class status and party. We know that this is a really complicated theoretical essay. We know that it's going to take some time before we become really comfortable working with these ideas. So yeah, I wanted to make this video. Now, the most important thing about this video is that you get some big takeaway ideas from it, and that it is a guide for you as you work through the primary text. We're not working with this video as a replacement or a substitute of the primary text. This video is really a supplement to help us grapple with some of these bigger ideas. Now, in this video, we're actually going to start roughly where we left off today in class. So we're going to begin with section 5. We'll briefly review the first 4 sections, and then we'll get into it. My goal here is to just better use our time. You know, when we're together in a Zoom call, what I hope for is a collaborative, conversational kind of environment. And if it's just me talking through Weber, then that conversational element is kind of lost. So what better way to use an asynchronous day than to share some of my thinking about Weber with you this way? And then that way, when we meet again at the end of the week, we are fully equipped to grapple with these ideas and to apply them to a literary text. In this case, George Saunders' short story, The Semplica Girl Diaries. All right, so let's get into it. We know that section 1, economically determined power in the social order, is really where Weber sets up his argument. He begins by talking about how the legal order is the thing upon which all of the other orders operate. Everything is about a legal structure that preserves power and that benefits some, but disproportionately benefits some versus others. He's especially interested in the propertied class. So he says, he gives us a definition of power, which is basically the chance of people to realize their will even against resistance, like your ability to do what you want. And then he gives us a number of different examples. He talks about how beyond the legal order, there is a social order. The social order is really just the structure of how status is distributed throughout a society. And then there is an economic order. From the economic order, we get ideas of class. From the social order, we get ideas of status. And the legal order kind of holds it all together. So you can think of it as like maybe like little donut, big donut kind of thing. I also like to think of these as Venn diagrams. You know, they are separate, but they intersect in the middle in really big overlapping ways. And we'll get a chance to talk about that too. Today we also moved on and talked about determination of class situation by market situation. This is section 2. And here Weber is talking about how, you know, we talk about class, but what we're really interested in is talking about how people show up to the market. Like if you want to buy something or sell something, what kind of power do you have? If you have a lot of power, that is one class position. If you don't have a lot of power, that's a different class position. So he's urging us to think about this not in terms of just sheer, what he calls naked money power. What he's really talking about is the economic power that one brings to the market. Now, as we talked about earlier today too, we said that Weber talks about how property and lack of property are, I'm quoting, therefore, the basic categories of all class situations. You have property or you don't have property. If you have property, you now have a lot of life chances that will afford you to do stuff with that property. If you don't have property, you don't have as many life chances. Again, I want to reiterate here, life chances, they are not guarantees of certain kinds of stratification. They are simply what Weber refers to as opportunities to compete in the market for goods or services. We also talked about section 3, communal action flowing from class interest. And this is really a way for us to, you know, just kind of talk about how groups of people can get what they want based on class interest. You know, if workers band together, they can get what they want, which is probably higher wages and less exploitation. You know, the propertied class, what Marx might refer to as the bourgeoisie, they can get what they want if they all band together. Now, there's more about this that Weber talks about here, but he's really talking about party, and that's the last section. So he's maybe giving us a little preview of what comes next. Now, we talked about section 4, types of class struggle, the difference between classes and communities of people. We also talked a little bit about how now we live in an era with what we call a credit market, where an easier way to think about this is a credit card. You can borrow somebody else's money to buy stuff for yourself, but by doing that, you actually reduce a certain level of your freedom, your sovereignty that Weber talks about. We see this in the Semplica Girl Diaries with the main character. Like, he just goes into debt to maintain a level of status on par with his neighbors out of love for his children. And we have to ask ourselves, like, is that right or wrong? And I think George Saunders would say yes, yes to both. Anyway, where we want to pick up today is section 5, status, honor. And when we talk about status, we really want to hammer home this idea that status is all about honor. You know, it's a kind of recognition from a group of people, a kind of honor based on any number of things. Weber begins by saying that unlike classes, status groups are normally communities, albeit amorphous kinds. Status is all about social honor, and it can but doesn't have to be connected to a class of people or even the ownership of property, although it might be. But people with and without property can belong to the same status group. And he uses this example of what we would think of today as a country club. You know, different people of different class positions can all belong to the same country club, and from that gain the same level of status. Maybe that's kind of a weird example, but there might be some others that you can think of. And if you can think of some more recent examples, bring them to class. As we move on, we get into section 6, guarantees of status stratification. And he says here, he's talking about status and lifestyles. Now, I want to pause in this section. Lifestyles are really interesting. Sometimes, if you've ever seen that show, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, that used to be on in the 80s, it's like pretty silly. There are a lot of shows like this where you can tour celebrities' homes, or, you know, they'll tell you about how they, you know, went to some exotic place on vacation, or, you know, went skiing in a helicopter or something. And this represents a lifestyle. Now, more specifically, it's about consumption, like what you consume as a person, right? But style of life, which is what Weber says, he's talking about lifestyle, is something that's really important when we think about status. So it isn't enough just to have a bunch of money, or maybe even have a lot of property. What you also need to do is embody or adopt a certain kind of lifestyle. We definitely see this in George Saunders. Weber says certain lifestyles place restrictions on who you can talk to or even who you can marry. Stratification of status groups, at least those with conventional lifestyles, like maybe you know, people who are like active lifestyle people, play sports, or maybe people who have like a posh lifestyle. This is like a British word that people use for like bourgeois or wealthy. You know, you drive luxury cars, or you wear nice clothes or something. These are all conventional lifestyles. Now, these lifestyles evolve, according to Weber, as American democracy evolves, and they become blurry. And when they become blurry, it's really less about the old way of determining status or lifestyle, and it's more about this new way. And now, new as in 1910, that was when this was published. And he says now, in the early 1900s, it's about clothing. It's about fashion. You got to look good. And he's talking about men here, but he says if you want to pass for a gentleman, all you have to do is dress up like a gentleman. And basically, it just comes down to a kind of like fake it till you make it kind of, you know, if you had to turn this into a bumper sticker, that's what it would say. And I want to really rest here because this is such an important part. He says status is about usurpation, meaning like to usurp, to take something that belongs to somebody else, take it as your own. He says status is about usurpation of honor. The direct quote is, the development of status is essentially a question of stratification resting upon usurpation. It's a question of organizing into groups based on taking the group's honor, the power. Such usurpation is the normal origin of almost all status honor. But Weber says, the road to legal protection and privilege, positive or negative, is long. Now, someone must live in the position and achieve stability by virtue of the economic order. In other words, this protection is out of your hands. Like, you're not going to be protected by the law, even though other people may look up to you. Legal protection, that's going to take a while. This is kind of tricky, but I think the best example that I can think of here is the story of this guy, Dapper Dan. I don't know if you know anything about this guy. You can look him up online. He just published a memoir. Dapper Dan is an African-American man. He's a fashion designer. He's a style influencer. In the late 1970s and early 80s, he was he was a tailor in Harlem. And if you were an up-and-coming act, New York City hip-hop act, and this is like the early days of hip-hop, and you wanted designer clothing that wasn't made by the designer, you wanted, like, I guess what we would think of as counterfeit designer clothing customized for you, you'd go to Dapper Dan. Dapper Dan still does this, but he does it under the approval of big design houses like Gucci. Gucci's a big one. So the idea here is that if you're a rapper and you're in an underground party, you're an MC, and you're going to go out there and, like, for 30 minutes, you're going to rock the mic in a real house party, and you want to look like a high status roller, like you have got real status and economic power, you need Gucci clothes or whatever designer name you want, right? But of course, you can't actually afford those clothes, and you don't want just the regular ones. You want the brand name, like, all over you. Dapper Dan has got you covered. Okay, what is this all about? Does it relate to Weber? Yes, it does. It does, because this is about taking status honor from people who regularly shop at places like Gucci and claiming it as your own. And if you do it long enough, you get that honor. So now we live in a time where if you're a rapper and you go on TV with a custom Gucci jumpsuit, like, that's a high status outfit. It wasn't originally, but people just did it long enough until it became a high status thing. This is one of countless examples of groups, especially marginalized groups of people, doing this kind of usurpation, taking these status symbols and using them as their own in order to then achieve that level of status for themselves. Weber goes on and he says that he also wants to look at what he calls ethnic segregation and caste. Now, this is useful because he says in more extreme forms of status groups, they become closed caste systems, like closed off communities with a hierarchy inside of them. Okay. In these cases, rituals become very important markers of status distinction. So if you just have one group of people and then there's a hierarchy, you want to preserve your status within that closed off group by creating some sense of ritual or something like that. You know, the person who can do the ritual the best is the highest status version. He says sometimes caste groups are organized along the lines of ethnic identity, but there are restrictions here, like, you know, blood relationships, like who's actually part of your community, who's not. Marrying within the community is seen as important, excluding others. Weber says sometimes certain ethnic communities become what he calls pariah groups. These are people who are shunned by other people, and they're forced to exist in exile or strict segregation. I shouldn't say exile, that's too strong a word. Segregation is really the best word here. Weber says that their position becomes legally precarious, meaning sometimes the law applies differently to segregated communities than it does to non-segregated communities. Weber also says that sometimes these so-called pariah groups play an important role in the collective economy of a society. And this could be through any number of ways. Like, maybe you just have a large population that makes up a market, right? Like, a group of people who buy your stuff. Or maybe you have some people who buy your stuff and other people who sell you things that you need in order for the society to function. Now, you can't exile this giant group of people, but you also have this kind of status segregation thing to have to deal with. So what Weber says is sometimes pariah groups are tolerated, sometimes they are maybe even given special privileges. This could look like any number of things. And sometimes pariah groups even live within politically mixed communities. Now, Weber cites the Jewish diaspora communities as a historical example of this. And I think historically, I'm thinking specifically of the city of Rome and the history of Jewish diaspora communities in Rome, and noodles especially. Many years ago, I had a chance to um, visit Rome, and I was with a person I met. His name is Lino, and we were talking, and Lino came from a Jewish community, and he was talking a lot about the history of his family in the city and how there was very strict segregation of Jewish communities in the city of Rome. Again, this is like a very Catholic community. So Jewish people were segregated into a section of the city. And what Lino loved to say is that, you know, all of the noodle dishes that tourists come and enjoy in the city are all a product of his ancestors. And we all laughed, and then we, I think, had lasagna or something like that. Now, this is kind of a feel-good story and a not very feel-good sense of history, but I tell you this because when Weber cites Jewish diaspora communities as historical examples, he's not only talking about Jewish diaspora communities. I mean, there are, unfortunately, a lot of different groups of people who fit this mold. And when we continue reading and watching films in this class, you know, we want to ask ourselves how groups of people, even not based on ethnic lines or anything like that, but just how groups of people are segregated, and then within that segregation, how there is a separate caste system that emerges and why. Okay, Weber continues on and he says, status segregation that grows into a caste is different from ethnic segregation. He says caste takes horizontally diverse, disconnected folks and then turns them into a vertically social system, like a hierarchy of people who are the super people and people who are the subordinate people. Now, he says ethnic groups encourage coexistence and then repulsion of other groups, but caste systems create winners and losers within them, a kind of hierarchy where the groups on top get more status honor, and then the groups on the bottom don't. There are many examples of this in the Indian subcontinent. I think there was a movie that just came out on Netflix recently that addressed this very issue called White Tiger, which I have not seen, but if you've seen it, let me know. Weber continues and he says, even pariah groups can operate like ethnic status communities, replicating the belief in their own honor or exceptionalism. You know, I want to pause right here and just kind of, if we're looking for an example of this, like, what's Weber really talking about? For me, when I was reading this, I immediately thought of like soul, like Black Power soul music from the 70s. And two examples that I think are really extremely powerful that I encourage you to check out if you want. Number one is the James Brown song, Sing It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. And the second one is Nina Simone's song, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. Now, these songs roughly came out around the same time, but they became Black Power anthems at a time when the civil rights era had suffered enormous setbacks, that Black cultural workers were being killed in acts of racist violence, or people were just dying because they were old. And what you see here are Black cultural leaders creating music that highlights the belief in their own honor and their own exceptionalism. It's not about the people who oppress them accepting them. They don't care about that at all. What James Brown is singing about is, you know, forget you guys. Like, I'm here and I'm going to be the author of my own status, the author of my own honor. And he does it in this song, Sing It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. And That is one of countless examples of what Weber is talking about. As he continues in the section, he says, this honor or sense of dignity can exist in positive ways, but it can also exist in negative ways. And negative meaning that it negatively impacts the group of people that are exhibiting this. One difference might be like WASP communities, like white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, versus like waves of immigrants coming into New York City in the late 1900s and the late 19th century and early 20th century. For those positively impacted by this sense of dignity and honor that Weber talks about, they're positively impacted because their dignity is because of their being, right? All you have to do is be something, and then you gain the benefit. If you are a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant and male, okay, especially, all you have to do is just be that, and you gain all sorts of status, honor if you live out east, in the early 20th century. I mean, hell, let's be real. It's like even today, right? Within a white supremacist patriarchy, like these ideas still are very much a part of our community, our world, our society. For those negatively impacted, however, Weber says, the dignity comes from a belief in an afterlife, which is carried out by a mission, he calls it a mission, and a belief in an honor before God. Now, Weber argues that this is one motivation for the religiosity of many pariah groups. Another explanation, and he's citing Friedrich Nietzsche here. You'll remember him. He's the late 19th century German philosopher and also kind of proto-existentialist, is that pariah groups represent what they don't have, and they resent what they don't have, and they use religion as a way to cover for what they don't have. So in other words, if you're not having sex, then you value chastity, right? It's not a deficit that you're not having sex. It's just that it's a benefit because you value chastity. If you're not drinking, that's a benefit, so you value sobriety. If you're dominated by a more powerful group, then you value pacifism and tolerance, right? Now, Weber says that Nietzsche's perspective here might be true, but it also doesn't always apply, especially in the case of some segregated Buddhist communities, because resentment doesn't really align with the Buddhist philosophy at all. So there are exceptions. Now, Weber wraps up, and he says that status groups forming from ethnic segregations isn't a normal thing, but status groups frequently produce an ideal type of person as its superior. An example here that he gives is medieval knights who are selected because they're like the strongest warriors in their village or whatever, or you have like the best horseback riding skills, or you're the best with like a lance or something. Still, there are other factors for us today, 1910, that Weber says that groups use when considering the ideal member of a status group. This could be political membership, class situation, etc. Now, today, Weber argues that class situation is by far the biggest factor in determining one's status position because it plays the biggest role in determining your lifestyle. If you have like an active, sporty lifestyle that involves riding in a helicopter to go skiing, it requires a certain level of economic power to make that happen, right? If your lifestyle involves driving fancy cars and wearing designer clothes, it requires economic power to make that happen, make that status position happen. So status position can be carried out in a number of different ways, right? But the biggest factor in determining one's status position is your class situation.